Welcome to this explainer. We humans absolutely love to keep score, don't we? We're always tracking things like the highest mountains, the fiercest hurricanes, or the oldest living people. But when it comes to the infectious disease that has caused the most death and human misery in our entire history, well, there's a clear, undisputed heavyweight champion. We are talking about a disease that ravaged entire communities, literally nearly wiped out civilizations, and left its survivors horribly disfigured or blind. Today, we're setting the stage for an epic biological battle between humanity and its deadliest foe, smallpox. To really wrap our heads around the absolute horror of this disease, we have to look back at the historical record. Just listen to this description from Zabdiel Boylston. He was a New England physician back in the 1720s, and he wrote of his patients suffering from purple spots, the bloody and parchment pox, hemorrhages of blood, ravings and deliriums, convulsions and other fits, violent inflammations and swellings in the eyes and throat, so that they cannot see or scarcely breathe. He described skin literally stripping off, leaving flesh raw, and patients looking as black as coal or as white as a sheet. This wasn't just your standard sickness, it was absolute unimaginable devastation. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this down step by step. First, we'll cover the speckled monster, followed by the anatomy of an invader, and the immune system overdrive. Then, we'll look at the vaccine breakthrough, and finally, how this virus became extinct in nature. Part 1, the speckled monster. So, the origins of smallpox go way, way back, likely emerging some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in Northeast Africa. The leading scientific theory here is pretty wild. It suggests that a pox virus that originally infected rodents actually jumped into camels when they were first introduced to the region as pack animals. Once inside the camel, the virus transformed, mutating just enough to become capable of infecting humans. And honestly, the timing couldn't have been worse. Humans were just beginning to travel widely for trade and commerce. So this invisible killer essentially hitched a ride on these new global trade routes, eventually spreading eastward into India and China, and later sweeping right into Europe. The formal name for this biological terror is variola. That's a term coined around 570 AD by a Swiss bishop. It stems from the Latin words varius, meaning stained, or varus, which means a mark on the skin. But you might be wondering, how did it become known as smallpox? Well, back in the 1500s, a horrific new disease appeared in Europe that left massive red welts, syphilis. People started calling syphilis the Great Pox. So just to distinguish between the two, variola became colloquially known as the small pox. But let me be clear, there was absolutely nothing small about its impact. By the 18th century, it was killing over 100,000 people every single year in Europe alone. That's a staggering toll. And to defeat an enemy like that, you really have to understand how it operates. Part 2, Anatomy of an Invader. Now, what's really interesting about this is how variola looks at a microscopic level. It's a marvel of sinister engineering. It belongs to a group called the orthopox viruses, which are absolutely enormous in the viral world. I mean, while most human viruses have maybe 30 genes, variola has nearly 200. Under a microscope, it looks kind of like a weathered rectangular brick. But notice how the virus shapeshifts to accomplish different goals. It actually exists in two forms. First, there's the mature virion, or MV, which acts a lot like a tank. It has this incredibly tough exterior meant to survive outside the body, so it can infect a totally new host. But once it's inside you, we see the enveloped virion, or EV. The EV is fragile. It's wrapped in two envelopes, and its entire purpose is a stealthy internal spread from cell to cell within your body. And the way this enveloped virion spreads internally, it is incredibly devious. Once it's created inside one of your cells, it travels to the cell's surface by riding on a set of actin proteins. It's almost like a train moving along a track. When it hits the surface, it forces that host cell to literally fuse with a neighboring uninfected cell. This creates a massive, multinucleated supercell called a syncytium. By fusing cells together like this, rather than floating freely out in the bloodstream, the virus can spread massively while effectively hiding from your body's circulating antibodies. It's biological camouflage. To successfully pull off this cellular hijacking, variola deploys a highly sophisticated three-pronged arsenal. First, it completely takes over the host cell's ribosomes. It essentially captures the biological factories that make proteins and forces them to only manufacture viral parts. Second, it chemically gags the cell, significantly diminishing its ability to send out cytokine alarm signals to the immune system. It cuts the phone lines, basically. And third, it blocks apoptosis. Normally, a sick cell will self-destruct to protect the rest of the body, but variola chemically prevents this from happening. It keeps its newly captured factory alive just long enough to pump out millions of new viruses. So, what exactly happens when those silenced alarms finally ring? Part 3. The immune system overdrive. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens next. When someone catches smallpox, usually by inhaling it from a cough, they go through a 12-day silent incubation period. They feel perfectly fine while the virus silently multiplies in their liver and spleen. But eventually, the sheer massive quantity of the virus becomes way too much to hide. The body's chemical alarm bells finally go off, and they go off in a grand, overwhelming way. It's actually this massive immune overdrive that dictates the horrific symptoms. Depending on a person's unique innate immune reaction, the disease manifests in a few different ways. About 90% get ordinary smallpox, which can still have a 50% mortality rate if the rash becomes confluent, meaning the blisters spread and merge together into one continuous mass. Then, about 5% get flat smallpox, which is highly lethal and mostly affects children. And less than 1% get hemorrhagic smallpox, where patients bleed profusely right into their skin. For that rare type, death was unfortunately inevitable. Humanity couldn't just suffer through this forever, right? We desperately needed a counterattack. Part 4. The vaccine breakthrough. The breakthrough really started with Edward Jenner in the early 1800s. He proved that inoculating humans with a much milder animal virus, cowpox, could actually provide immunity to smallpox. Later on, a related virus called vaccinia became the standard. But think about this for a second. Back then, there were no freezers, no modern pharmaceutical shipping. So how do you get a life-saving, live vaccine across the entire Atlantic Ocean before it dies? Well, in 1803, Spain's King Carlos IV commissioned a staggeringly ingenious solution, the Royal Expedition. They put 22 pre-adolescent boys on a ship heading to the New World. They inoculated 2 of the boys. A week later, when those boys formed lesions, doctors carefully took material from those lesions to inoculate the next 2 boys. They passed the live virus arm to arm like a biological relay race across the high seas. Because you see, this wasn't just a simple trip to the Americas. Let's move to and see how this builds, because it actually became the world's first mass vaccination campaign. Departing Spain in 1803, this living chain of immunity survived the weeks-long voyage to South America. From there, the medical teams split up. The vaccine spread north into Central America and Mexico. Eventually, they used the exact same shipbound relay technique to carry the vaccine all the way across the Pacific to Manila in the Philippines, and finally into China. Edward Jenner himself called it the most noble example of philanthropy in the annals of history. It was a monumental achievement that literally laid the very foundation for the modern global health networks we rely on today. From those early 19th century relay races, let's jump right into the modern era. Part 5. Extinct in nature. By the mid-1900s, global health workers weren't just vaccinating randomly anymore. They used a brilliant tactical maneuver called ring vaccination. Here's how it worked. When a case of smallpox was reported, teams would swoop in and vaccinate every single person who had been in close contact with the sick patient. Then they'd work outward in concentric rings. This created an impenetrable biological wall of immunity around the virus. And here's why this specific strategy was so incredibly effective. Because smallpox has that long 2-week incubation period, if you vaccinate someone up to 4 days after they've been exposed, the vaccine will actually still outpace the virus and prevent the disease from taking hold. So the crucial point is that all of this dangerous, exhaustive work by global health teams paid off in a way few things in human history ever have. In October of 1977, the very last naturally occurring case of smallpox was recorded. Through human ingenuity, global cooperation, and an incredibly aggressive, targeted vaccination program, humanity officially hunted the speckled monster to extinction. It's a triumph that completely revolutionized how we track, isolate, and eradicate infectious diseases around the globe today. It's a real game changer. But as we wrap up this explainer, we are left with a pretty haunting biological mystery. We know variola mutated so much over the millennia that it can only enter human cells, right? It has no known animal host, and there is absolutely no human carrier state. Once an outbreak ended in ancient times, the victims were either dead or they were immune. So where did the virus hide for years and years between those historical epidemics? Without an animal reservoir to hang out in, how did it survive those long waiting periods? Now that the virus is utterly extinct in nature, it is a chilling riddle we will perhaps never, ever solve. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.